Carlos Nelson with Cascade Media Group and What's Up Worldwide. And tonight, I want to talk to a gentleman that I met. I'm saying maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. 10, 10 years, and his name is. I always call him the General. General Arnold Gordon-Bray, and he went to school right here locally in Missouri. He served the country, made it up to the rank of general, and I wanted to talk about being an American, and especially being a Black American. Uh, and I wanted to invite someone that, as far as I'm concerned, had the same mindset as I have, because people misinterpret what Mr. Nelson does with his all of his different networks, because we always are having Black guests and Black issues, and people might think that I think a certain way, but I want to let everybody know that I think about that I'm an American first, and how you perceive me and how you perceive our company uh, is, if you are misperceiving it, I'm here to set it straight. So, without further ado, uh, welcome to the show, General.
Hey, first of all, Carlos, thank you very much. And I'm going to say this on the outset. Carlos and I have an incredible amount of connections on how we feel about our nation and how we feel about being African American or Black. And I think the appropriate term really is Black American, because sometimes, that we forget that Africa is a continent. And most of us, yeah, those of us who are in this country, most of us were brought here from different parts and different parts of the continent. Some of us, like historically, our ancestors may have even been given away as part of trade booty. Doesn't really matter. But we came to this country, and when it was in its floundering parts of becoming a country, becoming, and as John Adams called it, a new nation. But we've been part of this new nation since before it ever became an official nation. And we have these conversations, and sometimes I think it probably would be better if we did a shea kind of a conversation with Carlos and I, whereby you could see some of the disconnects, but the connections. In other words, we recognize we're Black, absolutely. And more importantly, we recognize the requirement that we have to try to uplift and or lift while climbing those of us who are Black. But at the same time, we're Americans. And as Carlos would often say, we built the nation. We built this nation from the time that we were trying to be conceived. Everybody tries to go back to 1776 and say, yep, that's when we started. No, that's when we signed some paperwork. But in 1765, there was the rumblings that we were going to be a new nation. And so if I may, Carlos, I'm going to just do a little history to get us on track and get us moving and make all these pieces connect if I can. And I know, because, by the way, this is for the audience, because Carlos is a pretty good historian. And he understands a lot of this, and he does a lot of study. But anyhow, if I may, everybody knows about what happened at the old North Bridge in our history tells us that in Concord, where there was a round fire. After we had fired been arguing with the British about being excessively taxed. Candidly, we weren't. We just had some people who were forward thinking, and that's the theme, by the way, America being forward thinking. And so here we are. First of all, it starts off, and one of the big things that was bothering us as a nation was, the Brits were tea drinkers. And I go back to 1865, we started talking about being taxed. being taxed excessively. We weren't. They were taxing everybody. The problem is we thought we were being taxed twice. In 1770, though, there was an uprising by some longshoremen. And this is where it becomes important to us very specifically. The longshoremen were led by a young man called Crispus Attucks. And by the way, history always it gets the writing right, but the pictures get wrong. And the pictures sometimes frame our mind. But he tells this group, I will not be a slave to any man or nation again. Crispus Attucks was a black man. And he steps forward, and he's the first person killed, and so deemed by John Hancock. He said the first American to die for this nation was Crispus Attucks, which, by the way, if you get angry at the flag, remember the flag has 13 stripes. The red stripes, the 7 red stripes, stand for the bloodshed for this nation. We are automatically now tied to the very first drop of blood for the defining of this new nation. In the Old North Bridge in 1775, by this time, we had now put together pickup teams to be ready to fight the British in the event that, one, they start to use force against us. Well, the Old North Bridge in Concord, this pickup team found that they were being oppressed, and a group of roughly 24 plus Brits had come up into Concord. There was some more behind them, but that's what really came forward. And this time they saw the Americans coming across the hill in formation. They'd never seen this before, coming across the bridge in formation. And they took up some planks off the bridge so the Americans couldn't cross the bridge. The Americans stopped on the bridge, got in position to fire. The British then fired. This was the first time that a colony now had fired on the Brits in any kind of a military formation. That was called the shot heard around the world. And we ran the Brits off. And at the same time, for the next year, we were negotiating whether or not we rebel, whether or not we try to really be a new nation or just being rebellious. This is the nature of our nation. We place freedom. We place our personal freedoms ahead of everything else. This is the core of who we are. Even though there were slaves in this country, at this point in time, we're starting to struggle with this idea, especially up north. We're starting now. A year later, we have this Continental Congress that gets together. Because by now there are skirmishes. The Brits are now getting angry, and we're having negotiations. And Ben Franklin is going back. He's doing shuttle diplomacy to try to get this thing not to happen, because he doesn't really want it to happen. But when he goes over to the Brits, they disrespect him. And it's often said that Ben Franklin goes over to England as a Brit, but he comes back as an American. And so now he starts to lead a lot of this discussion. Of course, John Adams, he's already in the game. He is already starting to argue for us. He has already declared us a new nation. Now, for all the Bible thumpers, this is important because many of the Christians fled Europe with the idea of having a new space where they could practice. Because remember, the Christians were fighting. It weren't Christians fighting the Islamist or Jewish. We were fighting each other. They were fighting, especially fighting against Catholicism, which, by the way, that threat stays as a thread into this nation in many of the Protestant religions, so much so that they were questioning whether or not John F. Kennedy would be a suitable for the United States, because they were afraid his loyalty might be associated to the Pope as opposed to others. So this is important for us today. I spent 35 years. Most of the wars I fought, by the way, were against people who were trying to put religion into policy. So we as Americans have to make sure we avoid that piece as well, because one of the core ideas of who we are is that freedom. Now, moving back, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time, but this foundational thought is important to who we are as a nation. So in 1776, we have 13 colonies represented by each one with a small contingent group. And they meet in Philadelphia to talk about what we're going to become. And John Adams repeatedly says, we are a new nation. And for those who don't really get it, a state has borders and boundaries. A nation is about culture, who you are, how you're defined. And by the way, John Adams wanted slavery, anti-slavery, to be part of our culture. And there was another young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson who was sleeping with Sally Hemings at the time, and he was struggling with this idea. But by this time he had met Benjamin Banneker and realized that his thoughts about the intellect and capabilities of Americans had been challenged already when he found a working clock and an almanac that remains accurate to today. So he knew that the things he had believed were being challenged. His upbringing was being challenged because all of a sudden now he had slept with a woman, been sleeping with her. Now, of course, that relationship, whether it's slave to master or whether it was lover to the unknown, is a whole nother piece. But we do know this. At the very end, he gave his slaves property, allowed them to make money on his property at different levels. Why he did it like that, times will tell. But what I say to you is to understand is that even in the formation of this nation, this was something very significant and very different from other places, because we were trying to be something different. I even use a term right now that begins, I call it Keep America Great Now, because the now of whatever time it has been, we have taken challenges of wherever the world was and we've moved it forward. So the first thing is, the flag wasn't just a flag. It was the battle flag of America, by the way. And George Washington had said that this flag, it would represent us and our Constitution that was finally put together and wasn't even ratified till after the war was over, 1787, excuse me. And so we have this new nation that blood was shed for, and a decision, by the way, that of these 13 colonies that had been made, the decision was based upon each colony saying that they don't object. It could not be a no. In fact, New York abstained, and they used a flimsy excuse by saying one of their candidates didn't show up, so they abstained. But every colony bought into it. And by the way, because slavery was brought up in the discussion, South Carolina and North Carolina had opined that they would vote no if slavery stayed in the writing of the document, which is why you don't see any mention of it being for or against in our Declaration of Independence. And I encourage everybody to actually read it, and don't just stop at that one pager. Go to the detail behind it, because what's really critical here is that each of them signed and said that they contribute their names, their lives, and all of their fortunes to this idea. Now, they didn't have even good semaphore to communicate up this East Coast, but they bought into the idea of personal and individual freedoms. That's the core of who we are. And they got a young Virginian to lead them, and then ultimately become the president of our first United States. And he did two things that I think you have to have at the core of any decision you ever make about this nation. The first is that no man is ever above another man. That's critical. Second, it is that we do peaceful transitions from one to the next. He had the opportunity to be a president, emperor for life if he chose. In fact, emperor was one of the titles that a Colonel Nicola had told him he ought to be. And Nicola thought he had done a great academic discussion as to why we need to have someone who can make the decisions very rapidly. Washington admonished him and told him, I don't know what in my being would make you think that. And more importantly, he said, because the men that fought and died fought against that. That's the core of this nation, a democratic republic, whereby each person can rise to their own level of incompetency. I get it. We've got laws that have hindered the African American from the beginning. But as I said before, we built this nation. It was built on the backs of who we are. The design of Washington, D.C. is also from an African American that talks about the defensibilities of what we're going to become. I even believe we're divinely inspired because God knows that we are going to be who we are and who we're supposed to be. One of the tidbits of history that really will get you is in the War of 1812, in 1814, when Washington, D.C. was being burned to the ground. The British were unopposed at this point in time. They destroyed all American forces in front of them. A hurricane shows up in Washington, D.C. with tornadoes. And after the American forces are gone, President Monroe is running all over town because he's been ran out. The buildings burning up, they're gone. No defensibilities are there. And a hurricane destroys the British force. Tornadoes destroy the British force. The remnants of that force escape back to boats, and then they come around and try to go back in through Baltimore. But by this time, another pickup team had put itself together, and that's where the Star Spangled Banner was written by a lawyer named Francis Scott Key. And by the way, that passed in there about slaves. It is referred to the British picked up slaves and made them part of their force. Has nothing to do with the American or slavery. It is talking about picking up the British, who use a lot of mercenaries and African Americans, which, by the way, that's why we never even talk about that second verse. But he captures the idea that we didn't walk away. We did not go away quietly in the night. George Washington also steps as president, besides recognizing who we should be as a democracy. The other thing he does is extremely important, is what he does is he says, when the Jewish people of Talbotton synagogue ask him, do we have a place in this country? He tells them that is one of the basic freedoms of this country, is the freedom to practice your faith. So we got to kind of understand that from the very beginning. There's even rumors that there was actually a Muslim who was an Islamist who was part of the founding fathers. I don't know, and I've not delved into it deeply enough, but the truth of the matter is I don't really care. Because in that other statement, he clarifies it. He clarifies that piece. And we have to kind of quit putting the times of yesteryear in the times of today. All someone really needs to do is look at the peer pressure of any situation that involves just local small decisions to the heavy-weighted decisions that many would have had to make regarding ethnicity and gender. That was an evolutionary process that we got past, and we are still moving past, especially considering that the prejudices of history started even with ourselves. Our individual self-love and recognition of other people has been challenging. It has absolutely been challenging. I've had the misfortune sometimes working for folks who were very prejudiced, but I'd never spent the time trying to worry about the things that would stop me. I have a thing called this valuation of one. There are always things that will impede your process, and there are things that you must do to get past it. That's a total value of one. If you focus solely on what will prevent you from being successful, you will never pay attention to the things that you must do to be successful. At the same time, it does not mean put your head down and just plow. It means be cognizant of the things that you must prevent or is trying to prevent you, but plow forward with all tenacity. I use a lot of my background as a former Airborne Ranger, and from Ranger School and playing basketball at the University of Missouri, is that UCM was a very prejudiced school at the time. It really was. In fact, it was one of the most conservative schools in the country. But I had so much support from those who looked like me around me, including my fraternity brothers of the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, and the folks from Kansas City that I could rely on, that let me know that success was possible, even in that environment. And so you look at the things that you must do. You look at the environment around you, and with the kind of people that Kansas City produces, I was able to plow through to look at what can take you forward, who can help you go forward. Because if you ever look around you, there's always somebody that acts as a buttress to help you stand tall. Coach Bush was one of my first mentors and friends because I was dating his daughter for a while, but he was an example of plowing through. You know, the Interscholastic League of Kansas City was called the house that Jack built for a reason, because he took those kids from Central High School and got them past the mindset of what the state would provide, because he had to go through that period where it was black, and then there was the white championships, and he was successful in both. The same thing had to happen with getting past the challenges both at the university and in this nation. When those first students come in or came in that environment, they plowed through. Because once you understand what success is possible and include this nation, you don't get stopped. Because if you look at what has to happen, you determine you can do what has to happen, and then you don't stop, you plow through. I'll give you all a small sample of something to look at people and to see how they think. Stand outside of any house, room, store, door, and watch the people that walk to the door and don't lose stride pushing the door open. And then watch the ones who always go to the door and try to figure out if they got to push or pull. They're just thinkers. And you can watch the ones that go into it and then they find themselves paused at the door. They expect that door to open. That's the way we have to think. You expect it to open. And if it doesn't, then you figure out what's next. Oh, I got to pull. Or I have to push. But expect it to be open. And that's a mindset that we have to adapt. You know, I love the descriptor that says we built this nation. We built it on our backs. But in that process, we also never quit thinking. That's why we had so many inventors that came out. The cotton gin was given credit to Eli Whitney, but the truth of the matter was there was an African and then American who got tired of screwing his fingers up, trying to separate the seed of a cotton, and said, I can do this better. I can save myself some labor time. And then he takes it and he talks to his then owner, but he says, well, look, let's figure out how to do this a little better. And oh, by the way, it changed this nation. Garrett Morgan and the gas mask later on, because we think we always have done this. The backs to build buildings. The mother of invention is always necessity. And, you know, while there were books that were saying, oh, well, the African was made to work in the field. No, we weren't. We worked in the fields as agriculturists, and we knew how to do it because that's how you survive. And they took some of those skills and moved forward. The first person to invent an antivirus was a slave who got tired of, who realized that if we had this in us, maybe it'll fight itself off. In COVID, there was a young woman from North Carolina, University of North Carolina, African American from University of North Carolina, who actually figured out how to defeat COVID and create the antivirus for COVID. It didn't stop. It didn't stop. And see, this nation has become fertile ground for that. And again, back to that notion that we are divinely inspired because we're that place where the world can come to. The world still wants us to be the shiny city on the hill. The world comes to us for solutions. We're the only nation that has in its vital interest humanity. Carter put that inside of our vital interest as something we would go to war for. We had done it before in World War II, obviously in support of the Jews, but we also initially were also part of the thinking elite world leaders who did not allow the boat carrying the most of the Jewish population out of Germany, the remnants, if you will, on ships to dock because we didn't want them either. But we learned our lesson. And Dr. King says it best that if you're not fighting something somewhere, it is a threat to people everywhere. And we joined in later on to fight that. And please forgive me if I didn't quote that right, but I paraphrase it incorrectly. But a threat is a threat to one part of humanity. It's all humanity. And so we in this country, we the African American, we take on a responsibility to much of the world. When apartheid was happening in South Africa, it was some of the American leaders, and in fact, specifically the last person to visit Nelson Mandela was a person named Mr. Robert Brown, Dr. Robert Brown, from here in High Point, North Carolina, about 2 hours and 2.5 hours from here, who was the last person he had been negotiating. He was the only person besides Winnie who could go in and see Mandela by himself. And after his last conversation with the clerk, it was shortly thereafter that he was freed. Another one of the African Americans, one of the Black Americans, who, is probably the most powerful civil rights leader you have never met, never even heard of, because we do stuff like that. This gentleman was also the same person that went down to Biloxi, Mississippi at the behest of Nixon to ensure that the Black Americans on the base were getting some of the same rights outside the gate as the white Americans. Nixon gave him one of his airplanes to go down and do so. We've been part of the change holistically. And he, similarly to you and I, Carlos, he places his nationality, and I won't say separately or above, but co-equal to his Americanism, because he recognizes that he is Black and an American, but he puts it in the context that America is and we're not a melting pot, by the way. Don't ever use that term. We are tossed salad. You can see everything that's in it. It just tastes much better when it's combined, because that's who we are. I once was traveling from the northern part of South Korea down to Busan, which is in the south, on a train. And a person who had pretended he couldn't speak English, but I watched his inflections and shifts every time his partner and I were talking. He looked at me and I said, "You can speak English, so why don't you?" And he looked at me, and he smiled a little bit, and he says, "How do you know I speak English?" I said, "Because your inflections." He says, "Well, you're in my country. Why don't you speak Korean?" I said, "I'm a soldier. And I go where my nation asks me to go, and more importantly, where our friends ask us to come." And your leader asked me to come here. And he said, well, but you're such a young country. And I laughed. I said, I'm not. And he said, what do you mean? I said, we are a new nation, but we're really not a young country. And more importantly, I said, we are the world. This is before the song came out, by the way. I said, we're the world. I said, because anywhere you go in my country, you can find yourself. You can be represented. And, of course, now he's at that point whereby if I could remember his name or had contact, he would recognize what I said holds true. Because we are that nation that the world comes to see themselves. We are that place where the world comes to be the best version of who they are, of who they can become. We struggle sometimes right now with some of our foundational education. But at the graduate level, you can see us again being the top universities in the country because we have the world best here. The world's best here. And by the way, this new country stuff, put it aside because we like to celebrate the Germanic people. They didn't become a country till 1864 with Bismarck. 1864 with Bismarck. Before that, they were Prussia, they were Austria, they were other countries running around. And they were trying to put the nationalities of the Germanic people together. To that end, we are a free-thinking nation of the world's best. That's this new nation that we became. And to John Adams' credit, he saw it. He saw it before others did. The Black America is part of that tradition. And sometimes you may even believe, or you should believe, you're probably the best part of it. And the reason why is because in addition to the unique mindsets that exist and resides within each one of us, we also have the labeling of a hint, of an accent, of a last name, of parentage that people can see and push back against without ever making contact. But we survive and we thrive. We elevate. And we elevate this country. So to that end, I think that we should always recognize that we're not a separate and distinct part of this country, but rather intertwined with its success and or failure. If I had good, sir.
Well, what I would say as us in opening, that there's a lot of things wrong over here, but there's a lot of things right, and there's no other place I'd rather be. And I don't know whether I could have had the opportunities that I've had in my lifetime anywhere else. They might have been there, but I go with what I've seen and what I've experienced. And I just wanted to have this program, someone that has served in the military. I haven't served in the military, but really understands at the end of the day, color, religion, and all of that doesn't really bind us to where we're at on this continent. Being an American cuts through all of the red tape, as far as I'm concerned, on what you believe, what you look like, and all of that. Because how the world is right now, for people that are sober thinking, they do not, if they attack America, they attack all of us.
Indeed. Have you read a book called Crime by Birth by Trevor Noah?
No, I get most of my information. I'm more of an audio. I listen to quite a few books and videos, and that's being in the communications field. That's where I feel our community falls short, but they fall short because uh, we're all programmed, but they've programmed us a little different. But there is information out here if you have a mindset to seek it. And information by itself really doesn't carry that much weight. Information applied is the ticket. And we, as Americans per se, uh, we're not as curious as we should be about different things, from climate to different things that are really important. But at the end of the day, we're all Americans. On your closing, what do you have to say to the audience in closing?
Yeah, first of all, I brought up Trevor Noah because though some of us will wonder about, well, the native land as used in a Lift Every Voice, Trevor Noah writes a book called Born a Crime. I actually everyone to listen to it or read it, and there's some book on tape. And he gives you a good descriptor of Africa and those conditions. And you'll find that under our worst conditions, we still exceed most of the best around the world. And whatever successes I've had, I don't know if they would have been either as rapid or as profound as they were in this country. And so when I look at that flag, I know it's a constitution behind it for what it stands. And I believe with all my heart, those of us who place that flag co-equal to or above our color will be successful, especially if they look around them and embrace those who elevate them. Thank you. Appreciate you. I appreciate what you're doing with Kansas City and indeed around the world with Cascade.
Right. Well, it's always, I'm still Jim Watts' closing line. He always talking about it's a plum pleasing pleasure having you on the show. But I'm going to close with our closing. When you invest in your community, you're really just investing in yourself. Good night.
This is brought to you by Kansas City Business Association, working to improve our community.